Hi everyone and welcome to Green Monk TV. This week on the Smart Grid Heavy Hitter series I have Ahmad Faruqui, who is principal with the Brattle Group. We typically start off these conversations with people just by saying, that the smart grid is a very loosely defined term. How do you guys define what a smart grid is?
Well, as you implied there, the smart grid is a multi-dimensional capability that basically involves the use of digital solid-state electronics technology to the grid that connects the power plants ultimately to the customers by way of the transmission towers and the distribution lines and circuits and feeders. The new element here that I want to emphasize is that it comes all the way into the customer's home or business. So it includes the appliances that we use in the kitchen and in the washing room. It includes our air conditioners and TV sets. All of those ultimately form part of the continuum that is the smart grid.
Okay, but a lot of those devices, all of those devices now are connected to the grid in that if they weren't, they wouldn't get electricity. So what's different about the smart grid?
All right, so here's the difference. Electricity flows in one direction today, and that's why the appliances stay on. However, the grid doesn't know which appliances is on at what time. There is no two-way communication, in other words, between the appliances back to the grid. It's just a one-directional activity. So with the smart grid, what will happen is you'll have this two-way communication link between the appliances and the grid. The grid will be able to send price signals, for example, or information signals to the customer telling them power is inexpensive now or power is expensive now, and here is how much it is costing you in real time. So the customers would have the ability to change their usage of the appliances, and the grid would know when they have changed that usage. And that will make for a more efficient power system, fewer outages, lower bills, and generally higher quality power than what we have today.
A couple of things come out of that. I guess the first is you talked about lower bills. And there seems to be a lot of consumer pushback in places where smart grids are starting to be rolled out. And the example that comes to mind would be the Bakersfield example in California, but there's a Texas one as well. So where people are seeing higher bills after the rollout of a smart grid and smart meters. How do we square that circle?
That's a very good question, and certainly it's issue number one today. And you mentioned two of those locations. I might add there's also a location in Victoria in Australia and Toronto in Canada. All four have had issues. And, because the smart grid has been the new element, so people have tended to blame the smart grid for the higher bills. But let's look at Bakersfield as an example. Bakersfield had very hot temperatures last August when those high bills arrived. 17 days in the month of July were above 100 degrees last year. The year prior, it was only 6 days, and California has had an inclining block rate. So people in the outer tiers or the upper tiers are paying a very high price for electricity. Even without the smart meters, the bills would have been higher. It has nothing to do with the smart grid. It's just a coincidence that the bills arrived soon after the smart meters had been changed out, had been installed, in other words. There were very few customers, by the way, who had those high bill complaints, but the media just latched onto it and it became a story, and the blame, of course, rested on the newest development, which was the smart grid. Not the weather, not the rate structure, not the rate increase that the utility had had a few months prior. In Texas, I believe the issue, again, involves very few customers. The utility is testing the meters, and so far what we have seen is there is no problem with the meters. It is again a case of unusual conditions and the blame being placed on the smart grid.
So are there any numbers out there which would tell us, Ahmad, how much this smart grid is going to cost us?
Well, it depends on what you include in the smart grid. If you include just, let's say, the smart meters, then in the United States, the number we are looking at is in the $40 billion range. If you include various other features of the smart grid, like in-home displays, like smart thermostats, then the cost obviously will start to ratchet up. Nobody has, as far as I know, added up all of those costs, but we have done an exercise On the other side of the equation, if you will, we have looked at the benefits of the smart grid. And what we have estimated is if you include the lower peak demands, the better energy efficiency, the lower carbon emissions, the higher reliability that you get from having the smart grid through distributed energy resources, for example, like photovoltaics. And if you include also plug-in hybrids, down the road, they will begin to penetrate the market. Then we have estimated about $500 billion in net present value benefits over the next 4 decades. So we have some estimate of the benefits based on a comprehensive assessment.
Okay. And there's all kinds of issues around the costs as well, isn't there? I mean, nobody wants to be responsible for them.
Yeah, it is a good question as to who should pay for the cost. The customers do not want to pay for the cost in the near term because their concern is that the benefits are somewhat nebulous and may not occur for a long time. The utilities will not make the investment unless the commission say, yes, you can charge the customers for the costs. So it becomes a bit of a catch-22. You also have the federal government, by the way, right, in the United States stepping in and providing grants of around $4 billion to fund 100 smart grid demonstration projects. So to some extent, the taxpayer is going to pick up the tab. And of course, the taxpayer is also the customer that consumes the electricity. It's just different ways of covering it. I doubt that any private company on its own is going to go in and cover these costs. In other words, there has been speculation that the IT providers, perhaps like Microsoft or Google or Cisco, or GE, they're all active. They're all looking at these smart appliances as the next big thing for them and their shareholders. But they're waiting for the commissions to create a mechanism through which the utilities can pass on the cost ultimately to the customer. And it's kind of very different from a customer saying, I want to buy a laptop and I'll pay for it. Or I'll buy a new iPhone and I'll pay for it. This is more of a socialized situation. It's a public good. And that's why there is hesitation as to who will pay. As you probably know, most people don't know what the smart grid is. I mean, there was a recent survey that showed that 75% of the people, as customers, as consumers, do not know what this is. So that's why they're reluctant to pay for it.
And in terms of time frames, how long are we looking at roughly before we see smart grids rolled out?
Well, right now, if we just think for a moment about the smart meters, about 5% of the meters today are smart. And we have about 145 million meters in the United States. There is an expectation that over the next 5 years, another 50 million smart meters are going to be deployed. This is based on already announced plans. And so there's a pretty high probability that you will see something like that happening. What about the remaining 90 million meters? I suspect that we will reach the tipping point about 4 to 5 years out. If these 50 million actually get deployed and there is no disaster, no big snafu, then I would expect that in the next 5 to 10 years, beyond that, we will see 100% coverage in the United States.
Okay, Ahmad, that's been great. Thanks a million for coming on the show.